Thank you so much. I'm not as Teams proficient, so let me get my PowerPoint up. Let's see. Okay. Can y'all see the parenting in a pandemic PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Awesome. Well, what I tried to do was just compile based on talking to some of the counselors and Principal Agans, just some different both resources and information that I thought would be helpful. So stop me at any point if you have questions. I do have clients after, so I will be scooting fairly quickly, but feel free to email me if you need anything. And I'm always available at Cambridge on Wednesdays and Fridays. So this is just a little bit about me and where I studied, and that I'm also from working at Summit for Cambridge and Hopewell, and then we have our Milton satellite as well. The first thing I kind of thought about is thinking about the past year and several months of what has actually changed for us, and talking to clients, watching the news, even just personally. These were some of the more overarching things that are not even family specific. We have wearing masks, a big one, working from home, taking COVID tests. That's really anxiety provoking for a lot of people and can be actually very painful. Remote learning, loss of loved ones, social distancing in a lot of different realms and capacities, people losing jobs, whether that's shifting to different roles or maybe looking for a new space to be working. That's also been something very prevalent. Little to no travel, loss of celebrations, some altered timelines. I have a lot of clients that have come back from college that have said it wasn't quite the experience I wanted. It didn't feel any different than high school. And so I'm going to go back when I feel like I'm able to actually have a college experience. How we manage our health, contact tracing, quarantining, pandemic-induced hesitation, just should I be doing this? Is this the safest option for me? And that's been a big one, I think, for everyone, trying to figure out what risk are we willing to take? How comfortable are we being in public? We have social media has changed a great bit, our appreciation for different things. And I think in this year, in 2021, we've kind of come back to that place of getting to celebrate a little bit differently and missing those things. And so I think we appreciate them more. And then Zoom and Teams burnout has been a big one. Staring at a screen all day, whether you're teaching or in meetings or in a class, that's been also something that's changed a lot in the last. So this is a compilation of what my students have been saying that I meet with, not just from Cambridge, but these are a lot of Cambridge students as well. I'm so overwhelmed, I can't start. That has been the biggest response that I've heard from my students is it's just too much. I don't know where to begin. And so they don't. School doesn't matter this year. It's not for an actual grade. Before this year, I've never heard students use the terms formative or summative. And now that's something that's been very prevalent for them. I can't talk to people, especially in this mask, and I'm exhausted and don't know why. So I kind of combined a lot of these, but these are kind of the big points of whether it's academics, whether it's their fatigue, and then also just the socialization piece. So those have been the big power points in our sessions. So the first thing that I've started off with is students often use stress and anxiety interchangeably. They use the terms like they're the same thing. And so we do a lot of psychoed on why they're not. So I usually use something along the lines of this graphic of what is stress, what is anxiety, and where is your peak performance. So you'll see in the middle here where the yellow meets the orange, you have optimum stress, which is enough stress to motivate us. It gets us through the day. It shows that it's important to us. And then we have this downfall where we reach exhaustion and then anxiety. So with a lot of my students, we kind of walk through those so I can further understand. So knowing this, are you anxious or are you stressed? Or do you have maybe just too much stress and we need to tone it down? Or is this a good level for you to be at? So that's a big piece of where I start in our conversations, is trying to figure out exactly where on this graph are they. As for parents, it's a little bit easier for me because they know when they come into me that they're going to be talking about their emotions, their school stuff, their social stuff, and we're kind of hitting all those places. They don't want to talk about that with their parents. And so sometimes it can be hard because your student's not telling you what's going on. So the two big things that we look for and that I tell parents is looking for any big change in your student's behavior. So whether that's a really large increase, a really large decrease, whether that's with food, sleeping, socialization. Any significant change can give us an indication that something's going on. And then lack of emotion regulation that's different from their kind of normal. So panic attacks, crying more often, having more intense isolation or anger are really big pieces that show us like, hey, something's happening. I may not know what. Well, let's talk about that change. Does anybody have any questions as of now? I talk very fast through presentations, so I want to slow down.
No, there are no questions in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you, Sam. So with the isolation piece, fostering connection has been especially hard this year because naturally we haven't been able to connect like we usually do. A lot of students are now back in their sports. We have a face-to-face school, and I think for the most part people seem to be doing what they normally did, but we really got used to not doing those things, to connecting with people online or not connecting with them at all. So we've seen a dramatic increase in screen time because they have to talk to their friends, to do their schoolwork. If they want to decompress by watching TV or playing video games, screen time has dramatically increased, and the activities that are outside, that are with people, were decreased a lot due to the pandemic. So their new normal may keep them from connecting with their peers, from trying to talk to new people, or even from doing the things that they did prior to the pandemic, whether that's sports, even just going to the mall, things of that nature. And so then we see a lot of loneliness. So this is a graph I use a lot with families, is talking about what are the different types of loneliness. We have intimate, social, and collective. And the biggest piece here is we want to have connections and relationships in each of these realms of our life. So you'll see on the graph, we have the intimate. This is our best friends, our immediate family, our significant others, and anybody that we feel like we have an exceptionally close relationship with. We also have social. So this is maybe a friend group. You're not as close with everybody in the group, but these are people that are really important to you. This could also be like small groups at church, teammates with sports, anything along those lines where you see them somewhat consistently. And then collective is the larger community. So maybe that's just people at school, people in your classes, people at your church, different things like that. So with those, a lot of times I'll see students who are missing one or two of these areas, if not all three. And so we may just focus on one area, usually starting with the collective piece. What do those relationships look like? Do you have anybody in your classes that you feel comfortable just laughing with? Maybe not having outside of school relationships with, but that you feel comfortable when you go in that class, that you have somebody there with you. So we usually focus in on one of these areas to make it feel a little less overwhelming and to highlight that you need all three of these. So if you have one and you're missing two, you have that one. How can we keep building? Which leads to the 8 types of friends we may need. So with trying to build connection and trying to deter from those isolation pieces, students often say, I just don't have a best friend, or I don't have a ton of friends. And I have to highlight that that's really normal. And we know that as adults, and we've gone through those different pieces. So this was from another therapist, and I kind of adapted pieces of it to fit high schoolers. But these are the 8 different types of friends that we need. Old friends, friends that we've been friends with since we were younger, maybe we grew up together. Confidant friends that you trust, so these are the best friends that you know you can confide in. Mentor friends, I kind of opened this up to even just being mentors, so having a teacher or a coach or someone that you can look up to, even if it's someone who's older in your sport or in your organization, those people that you can kind of lead and learn from. Work friends, so this would really be friends that, granted, it could be from work, but also friends that maybe you have classes with, that you talk to in those classes and you're friends because of those classes, but you may not hang out outside of school. Friends that you laugh with, these are not always the friends that we trust or necessarily our best friends. Maybe they're in that larger like social group. Neighbor or neighborhood friends, we're friends with because of proximity. Friends who share our interests, so again, they're doing and engaging in the same things that we enjoy. And then the 8th one is one that I adapted a good bit. This was originally friends that you double date with, and so we kind of shifted it to friends of your friends. So I may not hang out with them when that other person isn't there, but when they are, they connect us together. So this is a really good conversation to have, to highlight that Maybe you don't have friends in all of the areas that you're hoping for, but maybe you have friends elsewhere that you aren't recognizing that they are your friends, or you wouldn't categorize them in that way. So this has been really helpful, just talking about, I think, normalizing the difficulties in connecting in general, and then also with COVID and remote learning. Going into motivation and even social anxiety, this is a huge skill that I use that comes from DBT, which is dialectical behavior therapy. And it is probably the most simple skill to talk through and the one with the most resistance on the other end. Usually students don't like doing this, but it is really helpful. So each of our emotions come with an action urge. So a natural tendency with that emotion that we want to do that. And usually it's not very helpful and can even be harmful. So we have here with anxiety, that feeling, our urge is to avoid. I don't want to do it. I don't like this feeling. And so we avoid it at all costs. Best thing to do is approach it and take it piece by piece. So the example I give is I hate public speaking, and I'm very happy to be here with y'all today, but it's not my favorite thing. And so it does make me anxious. And so sometimes when I was younger and when I first started doing it, I would avoid these opportunities. Whereas now I know that if I approach it, that feeling is likely to decrease or not feel as intense. It helps me a lot because at some level I can't avoid these. They're important to share both for my job and then for the community. And so that's a big example that we use is with anxiety and that avoidance. We also have anger, which are urges to attack, whether that's physically or verbally. With siblings, we use this one a lot. And so the opposite action we would use is either gently avoiding those people or using a gentle kindness. So just giving them the amount that we feel comfortable giving without being aggressive, and then going back to that gentle avoidance if we're able. And then with sadness, isolation is the big action or action urge. And so the goal is to connect or be active. So if we want to be in our rooms and be on our phones and shut our door, the best thing to do is, if we don't feel like talking, just be in the space of other people, or get outside and do something that's good for our physical health, trying to connect in some way. I would even say reading is a great one to do, as long as we can do that outside of our room, because they're still connecting to something. The most difficult part of this is that with teens, they're thinking short term instead of long term. So short term, this is the best option, is to avoid, to attack, to isolate, because in that moment, I don't have to deal with that feeling. But with long term, that feeling's going to continue to come up and we're not going to know how to deal with it. And with long term thinking, we can also recognize that if we do the opposite action, we may be able to decrease the intensity of those feelings, the frequency of them, and maybe actually find that we're actually comfortable doing those things that once made us feel anxious. So this is one of the biggest skills that I go through with students. And there's examples for all the other emotions as well, but they're maybe not as relevant, but I'm happy to send those out too if anybody needs them. With motivation, these are the big things that we see that keep students from feeling motivated. So procrastination and perfectionism have a really strong tie in a lot of ways. A lot of my students who have either high anxiety or perfectionistic tendencies think, if I can't do it perfectly, then I'm not going to be doing it at all, which is so harmful because that all or nothing thinking is a really large thinking error and then puts them more behind, which makes them avoid it even longer. So again, the opposite action skill comes really in handy here. And procrastination is difficult because if students end up getting their schoolwork done, it's hard to tell them that procrastination is not effective because it works for them. So if your student is procrastinating often and still gets their work done, it may not be the biggest priority and they're comfortable with it. We have to be comfortable with it. It's not easy to do, and I even struggle sometimes with that and walking through those different procrastination tendencies, but they get their work done, and so if that's the way they choose, they can do that way. Constant changes, this year has been full of them. Again, stress and anxiety, talking about the difference between those. And then the short-term, long-term thinking, that lack of perspective taking is developmentally expected, but can be frustrating when we're able to see maybe in the future and visualize that and they're not. So I talk with students a lot about the types of motivation, which is intrinsic and extrinsic. And we walk through both of these, finding things that work for them. So intrinsic, coming from within ourselves, enjoyment, purpose, growth, curiosity, passion, self-expression, and fun. So do I enjoy what I'm doing? Do I get something out of it that makes me feel good? All of those pieces there, which can be hard with school. And then the extrinsic, so what am I getting that's outside of me? Do I get a praise or a reward for my grades? Does it feel good to have those maybe teachers give us the grades that we want? Sometimes that can be a great extrinsic motivation. And then also just hearing from the different mentors and leaders in our life that we are doing a good job can be great. Students do say they wish they got paid for their grades, which I know is not both possible and maybe helpful in most situations, but that's a big one. And then also just the reward of if I get good grades, I get to hang out with my friends, or I get to go to this concert. So we kind of walk through each of these and figure out what is it that motivates us. It is a little bit harder with high schoolers to find the intrinsic piece, but normally if we can connect to their values of what's important, we can tie that to intrinsic motivation. Well, you said that respect is a huge value of yours. Do you think it's respectful to kind of do these things on a timeline that fits you and your teachers and your family? So we can kind of look at it from that perspective, which helps. And then the big question, how do I increase motivation with my students? I think this year it has been harder than ever because of the changes with remote learning and face-to-face. We've seen a lot of changes with like due dates and I think like no late penalties. And so that's been really hard for students to grasp because they're thinking, I have until, and I don't know the specific date, but in May to get all this done, and I will. But we know that that's a lot of work to try to do in a week's time and probably not possible. So the biggest piece of helping a student increase their motivation is just increasing the probability that that will occur and starting small. So again, the example I give is I don't like running. It's not my favorite thing, but it's good for my mental health. And so if I want to make that more probable of happening, I'll put on my running clothes when I get home. So maybe I'll go, maybe I won't, but I've increased the probability that that will happen just by putting on my tennis shoes. An example a student gave me was, I think for their ELA class, they had to read and they just hate reading. They're not a proficient reader, they say, and that's a really difficult place for them to be. And so they make sure that instead of their laptop being on their bed, it's their book. And that they make a goal of reading like 2 or 3 pages instead of trying to read 4 chapters in a night. They usually read more than 2 or 3 pages, so that increases their confidence and they still get something done. Just starting. So a lot of times students will say, I have to complete this assignment and this assignment this weekend, and they give themselves timelines that are not realistic. And so we kind of go with, why don't you just start that assignment today? Usually they'll do more than just start. So again, it boosts their confidence. They get more done than they think they will. And it doesn't feel like such intense pressure to get so much done in a limited time. They've already completed what they said they would. Maybe they'll keep going. Addressing cognitive distortions. So the biggest ones that we see are the all or nothing thinking of, if I can't do it perfectly, I'm not doing it at all. It's too much, I can't do it all, so I'm going to do none of it. And then the magnification and minimization are 2 other big ones. So thinking that something is a lot bigger than it is, or thinking that it's really a lot smaller. So with some students, they have one test and it's so anxiety provoking, it is overwhelming for them because it feels like this is the end all be all. And so we walk through how it's one test and we do our best. And if we don't do what we wanted to do and get the grade we wanted, we walk through that with our teachers and with our other assignments. And for other students, they think it's just 1 year, it's not going to make a difference, and kind of minimize the fact that they have a lot to do in a short amount of time. And so we walk through and kind of address that maybe that doesn't fit their reality of what's happening. You feel that way and that makes sense, but it doesn't, maybe it's not congruent with what's actually happening around you. And then the least favorite, right now, students are learning how to problem solve. They're figuring out how they learn best, what works for them, what doesn't work for them. And so the term failure comes up a lot, and I know that students can fail classes. And at the end of the day, if they do, that was something that they chose, and they will have to deal with what happens next, whether that's summer school, credit recovery, maybe there's extra credit at the end of the year. That is something that is an option. It's a scary option, and I'm not a parent, so I know that if my child was on the risk of failing 1 or more classes, I would be as stressed as most parents are. And that's something that helps them learn with problem solving skills. We want to do everything we can before we get to that point of helping them address their thinking errors and talk about motivation and make sure that they're figuring out what works for them. And if they haven't figured it out and we can help them do that, failure might be an option, and we can figure out what we do at that point. So with students in the past, if failing a class or credit recovery has been something that looks like it's going to happen, we talk about what does that look like worst case scenario. So if you do fail, what do you do this summer? Okay, you go to summer school, there's credit recovery, you won't be able to play the sport you want to play, okay, or maybe I know a lot of students have like rec teams, school teams, travel teams, feeder teams, there's so many. So maybe you don't play on 2, you play on 1. And we kind of walk through, if that happens, this is how we recover. A lot of times worst case scenario doesn't happen. And so if they can figure out a way to cope with the worst case, they're going to figure out how to cope with anything below that. So not the goal, but it is an option, and we can work through that as well with our students. So these are some resources. We do have blogs on our Summit website that are, I mean, any topic you can think of. I did send some over to Ms. Kim and tried to make them fit with what we were talking about today, but there's also stuff on there for any difficulty or just the questions people may have. The Gottman Institute is also a great resource online. They pull their own blogs. They have a lot of resources connecting to other reputable sources. And then these 3 books are ones that I have used fairly often, especially Tim Elmore's at the end. So What Your ADHD Child Wishes You Knew. This is great for parents whose students have been newly diagnosed with ADHD or are still trying to grapple with the changes there. It is helpful in the sense of it is some like basic frameworks, but I think there's a lot of other pieces in there that could be helpful for parents who've been dealing with this for a long time. The Anxiety Relief for Teens is a great CBT book for teens to be using. Helps with mindfulness. I usually pull pieces and we do different pieces of it in sessions instead of the whole book. And then Marching Off the Map is great for teachers, for parents, educators. Tim Elmore has a few other books that are great, but this is one that really talks about how to navigate a world that maybe we didn't grow up in for these students. And so I went to see him speak about it. And I think he has, I don't know if it's a TED Talk or just something on YouTube, but he's a great speaker, has a lot of great information. And I use that a lot working with parents and families because we don't know what it's 100% like for them with social media and then the changes they've had. So this isn't COVID specific, but I think they're applicable in different ways. And so that is what I have for y'all today. I don't actually have my email up here, but that's the last slide. If anybody has any questions, you can also email me if that works better. And I feel like I ran through that fairly quickly.
Thank you, Megan.
You're welcome.
We can ask questions, or we can by unmuting yourself, or you can ask questions in the chat feature.